today's top boxing news.
Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford. Let's talk about the fight.
5 years, I told you. 5 fucking years.
I have so many thoughts about this fight, the build-up and how it played out. It's almost difficult to unpack as it has left us with a lot to think about. So let's just start off with what we saw. Let's start off with the nuts and bolts and how the fight played out.
Let's do it.
In the first round, which I scored,
I gave the first round to Errol Spence Jr.
if you saw my prediction video, you'll know that's what I was anticipating, that if history is any indicator of things to come, and it usually is, Errol Spence Jr. would try to establish dominance early by being the busier fighter of the two, being the more prolific puncher. I believe that's what we saw in the first round, while Terrence Crawford was very poised, controlled, creating space and moving around the ring, downloading information.
Feeling Errol out.
First round is usually a feel-out round for Terrence Crawford so that he can find out more about who he's sharing the ring with.
Who he's fighting.
Which is why he oftentimes doesn't do too much at the start of a fight. Characteristic of a Terrence Crawford fight, he's not doing a whole lot out there. He's just finding out more about who he's fighting.
So I gave Errol the first round behind activity, but it was all downhill in round 2.
And I expected that after 3 to 4 rounds, Terrence Crawford would take over, having found out what he needs to find out about his quarry. It happened much sooner than I anticipated in round 2 when he scored that flash knockdown. My suspicions about Errol Spence Jr.'s punch resistance were confirmed.
Can't take solid punches from Terrence Crawford. He can't take flush shots.
Many times in the build-up of this fight did you hear me say that Errol Spence Jr. might throw more punches in a round than Terrence does. He opens up more, but all that means is that he's open more, open to be countered. And it was Terrence's counter-punching.
Punches that you don't see coming do a lot of damage.
In just 4 rounds, after just 4 rounds with Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr.'s face was reduced to a bloody grimace.
It was bad.
Short, sharp counterpunches have a lot to do with that.
Errol only has one gear, really only one way of fighting a fight, and that has worked for him up until this point. He looks to impose his will on his opponents, crowding them mid-range to inside, throwing sharp hooks.
So if you've seen one Errol Spence Jr. fight, you've seen them all. As fight by fight, he's essentially fighting the same fight.
Which makes him easier to read, easier to understand. Fighters like Mikey Garcia and Danny Garcia, Sean Portier, these are not the kind of fighters that can make in-fight adjustments to exploit that fundamental flaw in Errol, that he really doesn't change much fight by fight, and he really doesn't change much or adjust in a fight, whereas Terrence Crawford,
it's just better all around. You can't pinpoint any one thing, just one thing that won Terrence Crawford this fight, because he was better.
He was better in every department, better all around, better with the jab, better out of the southpaw stance.
Ahead of the fight, I stated right here on the channel in my prediction video that Terrence would likely come out fighting southpaw, which would cause Errol Spence Jr. a lot of problems.
Errol's not used to fighting other southpaws like himself. If Terrence comes out fighting southpaw, that takes that advantage away from Errol Spence Jr., a prolific jabber who sets everything up off his jab. If Terrence comes out fighting southpaw,
it's going to affect Errol's jab. It's going to affect Errol's ability to close the distance, because then it's going to boil down to who's the better southpaw and who's got the better jab.
We found out.
Terrence Crawford exhibited the shorter, sharper jab of the two and was able to consistently snap Errol Spence Jr.'s head back with it, oftentimes stopping him in his tracks as both fighters would go to shoot their jabs.
Terrence's was more accurate.
Down the middle and landing flush.
Beating Errol to the punch.
And it was off the jab that Terrence Crawford scored his first knockdown in this fight. Off the jab with less than 30 seconds left in the second round.
Found out early this was going to be a long night for Errol Spence.
Wasn't wearing those jabs well. His punch resistance, anytime he got hit with a flush shot.
His reaction, his body language, how he received the punch. You could see that he's not wearing those punches well, and it was very early in the fight.
Errol Spence Jr., to his credit, rose to his feet more than once in this fight, still trying valiantly to gain control of this fight behind his jab, changing levels when he does it, trying to go downstairs, trying to go upstairs, but Terrence just wasn't there.
He's got better feet, better movement.
Staying just outside of striking distance, staying just outside of Errol Spence Jr.'s reach, creating space to set up counters.
Errol Spence, having been dropped in the
second round, fought with a sense of urgency in the third, attempting to outdog Terence Crawford in the pocket, closing the gap, and being outdogged in the process, trying to outmuscle Terence.
Widely perceived as the more physical fighter of the two and the stronger fighter in some circles, not mine.
Thought he could overpower Terence by crowding him, and he got outdogged in the pocket, which is saying a lot because mid-range to inside normally is Errol Spence Jr.'s
his range.
Sweet spot. And he found out he's not better on the inside than Terence.
He's not better on the outside. He's not the boxer that Terence is. He's not the jabber. He's not better on the outside, but he's not better on the inside either.
It was not encouraging at all for the plight of Errol Spence Jr., being out-hustled mid-range to inside as Terence Crawford took a shell guard, rolling punches and slipping in counter uppercuts and counter hooks.
Rolling and countering, catching and countering, and outright pushing Errol Spence Jr. off of him, thereby proving he was stronger in the pocket than Errol.
That busted that myth.
Terence Crawford was not only faster than Errol, sharper than Errol, but better on the inside and stronger punch for punch than Errol Spence Jr., who throws a lot of eye-catching punches. They're eye-catching, but there didn't seem to be much on them. The fourth round was yet another strong round for Terence Crawford, who upped the tempo himself, being creative with his punches, creative with his offense, counter hooks, counter uppercuts, straight punches from the outside coming in, backing off Errol Spence Jr., who by that time was reduced to a bloody grimace after just 4 rounds.
Just 4.
Had it 3-1 in favor of Terence Crawford after 4 rounds-1 after 5.
Things were not getting better for Errol.
Terence Crawford very sharp with his offense in the 5th round and very stout defensively, using a shell guard to either catch and counter or parry straight punches from Errol Spence, of which very few were getting through.
Eye-opening.
Spence couldn't pressure him, couldn't keep him under pressure, because whenever he tried to inch forward and step into his shots, he'd get countered at the door and backed off. Overpowered. Errol Spence Jr. badly bloodied and battered in the 5th round, both eyes swollen, blood streaming out of his nose. By that time, Terence Crawford had landed something like 58% of his power shots. 58%, that's anything other than a jab.
Hard night at the office.
Hard night for Errol, while Terence didn't have a scratch on him.
Terence Crawford continued to dominate Errol Spence Jr. in the 6th. Annihilated him in the 7th, scoring 2 knockdowns, one off a counter.
One off the ropes as Errol Spence Jr. attempted to apply pressure, and another off a counter right hook. I told you about those right hooks and their role in this fight.
Right hook's gonna be sweet.
Right uppercut, right hook. Terence kind of took off the 8th round, and I anticipated he was taking off the 8th so he could come on strong in the 9th.
Still won the 8th round, taking his foot off the gas, but I anticipated he's taken off the 8th so he can rally back in the 9th.
With less than 30 seconds left in the 9th round, Terence Crawford finished the show off a series of hard shots, hard hooks. Errol was clearly out of this fight, and referee Harvey Dockey was right to save him because it didn't look like Derek James was going to.
Credit to Errol Spence Jr., who, in spite of being floored and dominated over 9, he didn't want to give up. He didn't want to stay down.
There was justifiable cause for Derek James to stop this fight, to stop it in the 7th.
I was surprised that he didn't.
The 9th, Harvey Dock was left with no choice but to stop it himself and save the fighter when the fighter could not save himself. For 5 years, I told you, Errol Spence Jr. don't belong in the same ring with Terence Crawford, a fighter often slighted and marginalized by the American boxing media and many members of the American boxing community. How do you like those apples? Immediately after the fight, Errol Spence Jr. was quoted as saying Crawford was just better. My timing was off. He was the better man, and Errol's timing being off has a lot to do with the layoff. The amount of time he spent away from the ring after the Ugas fight.
Though it can hardly be used as an excuse for Errol to have performed the way he performed, because that was a self-inflicted wound.
If he wanted, what he could have done was continue to negotiate with Terence the way that he did at the start of the year, keep the ball rolling, keep the conversation going while squeezing in a tune-up fight against Keith Thurman. So the night of the Crawford fight, he might be a little bit sharper.
Providing reassurances to the fans that the fight with Crawford will happen, but he's going to squeeze in a tune-up fight. Though Errol, as you all may know,
He doesn't believe in tune-up fights.
And this is the end result. Errol was quoted as saying he was just better tonight. He was using the jab. My timing was a little bit off. He was just the better man tonight.
My honest opinion is that Terrence was always the better man. He was the better man yesterday, and he was the better man 5 years ago.
Although the reason I think the fight should have taken place 5 years ago instead of 5 years later is because for Errol, 5 years ago, the weight wasn't as difficult to make. Don't misunderstand me. I've always favored Terrence Crawford to win the fight 5 years ago and 5 years later, but the difference would have been that Errol would have took the punches better.
The fight would have lasted a little longer. It would have been at least more competitive in spots.
Large part of the reason I favor Terrence Crawford to win this fight 5 years ago or 5 years later is because the same advantages that he had as a 35-year-old man going on 36, well, those would have been the same advantages he had 5 years ago. He still would have been faster and sharper than Errol. He still would have had a better ring IQ.
He still would have beat him.
But Errol likely wouldn't have come apart at the seams so quickly 5 years ago. 5 years later,
He started to unravel after just 2 rounds. 2 rounds.
he was just throwing that hard jab, said Spence. He was timing with his jab. His timing was just on point. I wasn't surprised by his speed or his accuracy. It was everything I thought.
5 years ago, Errol wasn't struggling as much as he is here today to make 147. And 5 years ago, he hadn't been in the car accident yet. He hadn't suffered the detached retina. So Errol was a more solid fighter 5 years ago than 5 years later.
Still think Terrence would have beat him because of the aforementioned advantages. That Terrence does have more ring savvy and more ring IQ, more variety than Errol. He's a sharper, faster fighter.
And he's a switch hitter.
It's a big part of the reason I've always favored Terrence Crawford to beat Errol Spence Jr. Now, former WBC heavyweight champion Deontay Wilder said it seemed like Errol was a little drained, and he couldn't really do what he needed to do, but definitely took advantage. I really think Errol
Over-dehydrated himself.
You could see it in his skin and in his eyes. Deontay Wilder is using...
He's basically saying that Errol Spence Jr. overstayed his welcome at welterweight and the weight affected him. But need I remind you that he could have had the Crawford fight years ago, back when Crawford was still with Top Rank. Whose idea was it to put this fight off so he could go fight other people?
Between Top Rank and the PBC, we saw Wilder versus Fury 2 and 3, so it wasn't beyond their ability to work together to make that fight, make it sooner rather than later. They're the ones that didn't want to do that.
PBC didn't.
Thus, you can't use weight as an excuse. Errol Spence Jr. isn't. He refuses to make excuses after his defeat to Terrence Crawford. I'm a grown man. I agreed to the weight. No excuses. Hats off to the champion tonight.
Can't use weight as an excuse even if you believe that it was a factor in yesterday's contest, because that didn't have to be the situation. That's what Errol's handlers chose for him, and that was the consequence.
Never had to take this long. It never had to be this way. If they would have struck while the iron was hot and while Errol was a more solid fighter, I still think Terrence would have beat him. I still think Terrence would have knocked him out in either the 11th or 12th round.
Just would have took longer, and Errol would have took the shots better, but I still think he would have lost. And if you don't believe me, just check the catalog. Go back to those videos I did in 2018 and 2019. I've been saying the same thing for 5 years.
Terrence is the far superior fighter. Errol Spence Jr. has said that he wants the Terrence Crawford rematch to be at super welterweight, 154 pounds, and Crawford has also welcomed this idea, saying, 147 was kind of hard for me too. I was already talking about moving up and challenging Jermell Charlo, so 154 wouldn't be out of reach.
That was expected.
I'll tell you the truth that this fight was so lopsided, I don't even see the need for a second one. I don't even see the need for a rematch. And if Errol Spence Jr. knows what's good for him, he won't activate that clause. Because at 154, it's not going to go any differently, you understand. He might be a little bit more solid, little bit more durable, but he's still going to get hit. He's still going to get hit a lot. Rematches are often won by the fighter that can make the most adjustments, and that is not Errol Spence Jr.
Because if he could have made an adjustment, he would have yesterday.
Terrence Crawford spoke on Errol Spence Jr.'s power, saying, in the second round, when I heard him, I felt he couldn't handle my power like I could handle his. I threw an overhand left and he caught me right on the button. I was just like, this is it? Oh, okay, it's gonna be a long night for him.
It's exactly what it was.
You see, at 154, Errol might not be as depleted, boiling down to 147, but that also applies to Terrence. So if Errol is a little bit more durable and a little bit more energized as a junior middle, Terrence will be as well.
If he knows what's good for him, he won't activate that rematch clause because the rematch won't go any differently. This guy's got your number. He's better than you are in every department, and a few extra pounds isn't going to change that.
Terrence is king. Terrence Crawford, who said, "They said I wasn't good enough. I believe I showed how great I am." Indeed, he did going into this fight. In spite of all the aforementioned circumstances I talked about here on this channel, the usual suspects were still going with Errol to crush Terrence Crawford, that he'd be too big and too strong.
It's what they said before the fight, so you don't get to make excuses afterwards.
Like I said before, I only dreamed of being a world champion. I'm an overachiever. Nobody believed in me when I was coming up, but I made everybody a believer. I want to thank Spence and his team, because without him, none of this would have been possible.
I think Spence underneath it all knew what was waiting for him, but he decided to go through with it anyway for his own honor, to settle his own spirit and his own soul, that he didn't run.
That he was a man of his word, and he would fight. He would at least try to become an undisputed champion. The win means everything because of who I took the belts from. They tried to blackball me. They kept me out. They talked bad about me. They said I wasn't good enough and I couldn't beat these welterweights. I just kept my head to the sky and kept praying to God that I would get the opportunity to show the world how great Terrence Crawford is. Tonight, I believe I showed how great I am. We practiced that. Normally in camp, we do a flick and a jab, but we knew that wasn't going to work with Errol Spence because he's durable. He's strong. So we had to practice a strong, firm jab. The jab hit him and stopped him in his tracks. It was a good stoppage. I was on the verge of coming back with some hard shots. Everybody knows I'm a great finisher. The ref did what he was supposed to do to protect the fighter.
Closing thoughts.
I don't think that Derek James is a bad trainer or that Errol Spence Jr. is a bad fighter. I just feel he's too basic for a Terrence Crawford. I've always felt that way. That Errol, doing what he's doing or doing what he's done, he would find some success, but if you put him in there with Crawford, there will be clear separation. We saw that come into fruition yesterday, in spite of all the narratives propagated against Terrence and anyone who supports him.
The truth always comes out. The truth always prevails.
You can only suppress it, but for so long, and the truth is that while Errol fancies himself the truth, he was the lie.
It was only a matter of time before Terrence exposed him.